My name is Caroline Brooks, and this is the story of how 10 years of waiting tables changed the course of my life. I grew up in the northern part of the United States, in a small suburb just outside Duluth, Minnesota. Our house was old and drafty in the winter, with a slanted porch that creaked when you stepped on the middle board. It had been in our family since before I was born. My grandfather, Samuel Hart, lived with us from the time I was 12, after my grandmother passed away. He was the kind of man who always smelled faintly of cedar and black coffee, and even as a child, I remember how his laughter filled the house. When I turned 20, Grandpa fell seriously ill. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away, and then, slowly, he became too weak to work or even walk far. My parents had already passed, and my older brother, Victor, had moved away years earlier to study medicine in Ohio. That left me. Someone had to keep the lights on and the bills paid, and that someone was me. I applied to every job in Duluth I could find, bookstores, gas stations, grocery stores, but the only one that called me back was a diner on Lake Avenue, a place called the Silver Spoon. I told myself I would do it for a year, just until Grandpa's health improved or Victor sent some help. 1 year became 2, and then 3, and by the time I realized how long it had been, a whole decade had passed. 10 years of worn-out aprons, sticky tables, and coffee cups refilled 1,000 times. 10 years of carrying plates while pretending not to hear the rude jokes or impatient sighs from customers who thought I was invisible. But what they didn't see was that every dollar I earned kept my grandfather comfortable, kept his medicine paid for, and kept our small house warm through the cold Minnesota winters. Every morning, I put on the same black uniform, pinned my name tag over my chest, and tucked the little notepad into my apron pocket. The first few years, it was just work, hard, tiring work, but after a while, the diner became my second home. I learned people's favorite breakfasts by heart. The man in the green jacket always wanted 2 eggs over easy. The retired teacher from the next town asked for blueberry pancakes with extra syrup. I'd smile, take their orders, and try to keep my hands from trembling when I was tired. My brother, Dr. Victor Brooks, would visit from time to time. He worked at a private clinic in Cleveland, Ohio, and liked to show off his white coat and his expensive shoes. He'd come into the diner sometimes when he was back in town and sit at one of my tables smirking. "The waiter's outfit suits you so much," he'd say, sipping his coffee with that grin I'd known since childhood. "Your children will probably do the same job." He always said it loudly enough for the other staff to hear. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd smile tightly and refill his coffee. My coworker, Elena Price, the diner's cook and one of my closest friends, would shoot me a sympathetic look from behind the counter. She was the kind of woman who spoke her mind, and after Victor left, she'd always find a way to make me laugh again. "He might wear a doctor's coat, but he's missing a heart," she once said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You've got both." Those words carried me through more nights than I can count. There were evenings I'd come home with sore feet and tears threatening to fall, but the moment I stepped into Grandpa's room and saw his smile, everything softened. His face was lined with age, but his eyes still held that same spark. "Carry on, Carrie," he would say when I told him about my day. "You're the brave one. Don't let anyone make you forget that." I used to tell him about all the little things that happened at the diner. The broken coffee pot, the new manager who couldn't remember anyone's name, or the time a customer left me an $18 tip on a $20 meal. Grandpa always listened as if it were the most important story in the world. Sometimes he'd chuckle, sometimes he'd just nod, and sometimes he'd close his eyes, and I'd see the pride in his expression, quiet but steady. Over those 10 years, I learned the value of small kindnesses. I learned that you don't have to be rich to be generous, that a smile can change someone's whole morning. When I'd see lonely regulars come in, people who just wanted someone to talk to, I made sure to take a little extra time at their tables. One of them, an old man named George, used to leave me notes written on napkins. "You make my coffee taste better," one of them said. I still have it in a drawer somewhere. But no matter how many kind moments filled the days, there were nights when doubt crept in. I'd wonder what my life could have been if I'd followed my own dreams instead of standing behind a counter for 10 years. I'd think about Victor's career, his clean suits and high salary, and I'd feel small. But then I'd remember Grandpa's frail hands and the sound of his voice calling me his greatest blessing. That was enough to remind me why I was doing it. Money was always tight. Most weeks, I kept only $40 for myself, just enough for groceries and bus fare. The rest went to Grandpa's medicine and home care. Sometimes I skipped meals, so he wouldn't have to skip any of his pills. It wasn't a sacrifice. I never thought of it that way. It was love, the kind that doesn't make noise or demand thanks. There were times I dreamed of leaving Minnesota, of starting fresh somewhere like Denver or maybe Portland, somewhere far enough that the cold couldn't follow me. But every time I thought about it, I looked at Grandpa and stayed. The world could wait. He couldn't. The last winter before everything changed was the hardest one. Snow piled up against the windows, and the heater broke twice. Grandpa's cough grew worse, and I started to see the fear in his eyes, the kind he tried to hide. One night, after my shift, I sat beside him and held his hand. "Don't you worry about me," he whispered, his voice weak but steady. "You've done enough, Carrie. More than anyone else ever did for me." I squeezed his hand and said nothing. I wanted to tell him that I'd never stop taking care of him, that I didn't know who I was without him, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't know then that those would be some of our last conversations. All I knew was that I'd built my life around the simple act of showing up, day after day, shift after shift, because love isn't loud or glamorous. It's steady, like a diner open through every storm. And though I couldn't see it yet, those years in an apron were preparing me for something much bigger than I could have imagined, something that would turn my life and everyone's expectations of me completely upside down. The winter I turned 30, Minnesota froze over in a way that felt personal. Snow buried the streets in heavy folds, and the world outside my window was silent except for the low hum of the heater in Grandpa's old house. I'd worked a double shift the night before when the call came from the hospice nurse. "Caroline," she said softly, "you should come now." I drove through a storm that blurred everything beyond the headlights, my hands trembling on the wheel. By the time I reached the hospice center, it was too late. Grandpa had passed peacefully in his sleep an hour earlier. He was 87. The nurse handed me his watch, an old silver one that hadn't worked for years, and said, he kept it on the nightstand. Said he didn't need it to tell time anymore. I held it in my palm, the weight of it strange and light at the same time. The funeral was held 4 days later at a small brick church in St. Paul. I wore a black dress that I hadn't worn since my mother's service. The church was filled with people I didn't recognize. Old friends of Grandpa's from his days working at the shipping yard, neighbors from Duluth who remembered him fixing their fences or mowing their lawns for free. It struck me then how quietly kind he had been. He never had much, but he gave what he could, even if it was just time or a helping hand. Victor arrived just before the service started, stepping out of a rented black car. He wore an expensive suit, of course, probably cost more than my monthly wages at the diner. He hugged a few relatives, shook hands with people he barely knew, and didn't once look my way. I stayed near the front pew, trying not to notice the way he avoided me. But I knew him well enough to recognize the tension in his jaw, the same look he used to get when things didn't go his way. After the burial, when everyone had gone, Aunt Lila approached me in the churchyard. She had been Grandpa's youngest sister, gentle and quiet, with soft gray hair always pinned neatly at the back. "Your grandfather wanted the family to gather next week," she said, handing me an envelope. "The lawyer will read the will then." He was very clear about that. The following Friday, we met in the law office of Martin Cole, a thin man with round glasses and a voice like polished wood. His office smelled of ink, paper, and something faintly lemon. The snow outside had turned into slush, dripping from the window ledges as the radiators hissed softly. Victor sat across from me at the long mahogany table, his posture stiff and self-satisfied. I knew he expected to inherit everything. After all, he was the successful one, the doctor, the pride of the family. I was just the sister who spent a decade carrying trays and cleaning tables. Martin began to read, his voice slow and deliberate. The will started as most do, formal introductions, property lists, and the naming of heirs. I listened, numb, until I heard my name. To my granddaughter, Caroline Brooks, who has cared for me with love and patience all these years, I leave the entirety of my estate. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. Martin continued, including the sum of $1,200,000, the property on Riverbend Lane, the vehicles, and all remaining personal assets. The room went dead quiet. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I saw Victor's jaw tighten, then drop slightly in disbelief. Aunt Lila pressed a tissue to her mouth, whispering, "Oh my." But Martin wasn't finished. He turned the page and said, "However, these inheritances are bound by two conditions explicitly outlined by Mr. Samuel Hart." Victor leaned forward sharply. "Conditions?" Martin nodded. "The first condition is that Miss Brooks shall not, under any circumstance, give or transfer a single dollar, pound, or property belonging to this inheritance to her brother, Dr. Victor Brooks. In fact, Mr. Hart specifies that she must sever financial and personal ties with him altogether." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Victor laughed bitterly. "You can't be serious. This is absurd. She's barely capable of handling her own bills, let alone this kind of money." Martin's voice didn't waver. "The will is legally binding, Dr. Brooks. Your grandfather signed it before two witnesses, and it has been verified." Victor turned his fury on me. "You did this. You poisoned him against me." "I didn't even know he had money," I said quietly, though my voice shook. "I was too busy making sure he could eat and sleep without pain." Martin cleared his throat and continued. "The second condition, Caroline must use half of her inheritance to build a magnificent home, a lasting symbol of the care and loyalty she showed her grandfather. The property must be in her name and completed within 3 years of estate." I stared at the lawyer, barely breathing. A house, half the money, a monument to a decade of scraped knuckles and tired smiles. It sounded impossible, and yet so perfectly like Grandpa. He had always believed in doing something real, something that could stand and be seen. Victor slammed his palm on the table. "You expect her to build a house? With that money? She'll waste it in a year." "Please," Aunt Lila said softly. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Victor stood up, his face red. "You'll regret this, Caroline. He may have left you his fortune, but everyone knows you don't deserve it." Then he stormed out, slamming the office door behind him. The silence afterward was heavy. Martin finally looked at me and offered a small, kind smile. "Your grandfather spoke very highly of you, Miss Brooks. He said this was not about money. It was about legacy." I nodded, still stunned. "Legacy," I whispered. The word didn't feel real yet. When I left the office, the snow had started again, softer this time, flakes drifting like ash in the air. I stood on the steps and tried to take it all in, the anger, the loss, the strange, dizzying feeling of victory that I wasn't sure I wanted. That night, I sat alone at Grandpa's kitchen table, staring at the old watch beside a cup of untouched tea. The ticking had long stopped, but somehow it still marked time in my head. I thought about what the lawyer had said. A house, a home built from gratitude. I imagined a wide porch with blue shutters, a garden full of sunflowers, and a room filled with light, the kind Grandpa would have loved to sit in with a good book. It wasn't just about proving anything to Victor or the rest of the family. It was about proving something to myself, that I could take the years of hard work and make them mean something lasting. Grandpa had seen that in me long before I ever believed it myself. I folded the watch back into my palm and whispered into the stillness. "I'll do it, Grandpa. I'll make it real." Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the ground in a clean, white silence, as if the world was giving me a blank page to begin again. After the reading of the will, something inside me shifted, quietly but deeply. For 10 years, I had been standing in one place, waiting tables and waiting for life to begin. Now, suddenly, I was holding a fortune that felt less like a gift and more like a responsibility. Grandpa's words, his conditions, stayed with me day and night. The first condition was about cutting Victor out of my life completely, and the second demanded that I build a magnificent house as proof of what love, work, and loyalty could create. Those weren't just rules, they were lessons wrapped in stone. By spring, I decided to leave Duluth. The snow was melting, the streets slick with water and grit, and it felt like the right time to start again. I packed my life into 3 boxes, one for clothes, one for keepsakes, and one for Grandpa's things. I sold the old family car for $2,800 and bought a one-way ticket to Denver, Colorado. The air there was thinner, the light brighter, and the city felt alive in a way that whispered of new beginnings. When I arrived, I rented a small one-bedroom apartment near Cheeseman Park. It wasn't much, just a second-floor unit with creaky floors and a narrow balcony, but it had sunlight, and I needed that. The first week, I opened a new bank account and wrote down the numbers on a white index card. $1,200,000 total, $600,000 for the house, $600,000 for life and planning. I carried that card in my wallet like it was a map to my new self. The idea of building a house scared me at first. I knew nothing about architecture or construction. The only houses I had ever stepped into were ones I'd cleaned, served food in, or dreamed about in the pages of magazines. But I could hear Grandpa's voice in my head. "You'll figure it out, Carrie. You always do." So I started small by reading. I spent hours at the Denver Public Library, flipping through books about home design, materials, and budgeting. I watched videos about modern builds, about how wood meets glass, and how light could change a room. One morning, I found an architecture firm downtown called Bell and Reed Designs. The name sounded steady and trustworthy, so I made an appointment. When I walked in, the office was bright and smelled faintly of coffee and pine. The walls were covered with sketches and models, homes that looked like dreams waiting to stand upright. The architect I met was named Nora Bell, a woman in her early 40s with short, silver-streaked hair and calm eyes that seemed to see through clutter straight to meaning. "Tell me about your house," she said, offering me tea instead of coffee. I hesitated. "It's not just a house. It's a promise. To my grandfather." Nora smiled. "Then it should be a home that tells his story and yours." We met every week after that. We talked about design and purpose, about how a home could reflect love instead of luxury. She introduced me to Marcus Reed, her business partner and lead builder, a tall, kind man who wore his baseball cap backward and spoke about foundations and framing like they were poetry. We found a piece of land on the edge of Denver, up on a small hill overlooking the city skyline. From the top, you could see the mountains, a thin, white ribbon on the horizon, and at night, the lights below shimmered like fallen stars. The lot cost $210,000, and when I signed the papers, I could almost feel Grandpa's approval, quiet and sure. The design process took 2 months. Nora's first sketch was perfect, a home filled with sunlight, big open windows, and a long front porch. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a library. A small room with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a single green reading chair, because Grandpa had always said every home needed a place for stories. We decided on a deep blue front door and warm oak stairs that felt alive underfoot. I asked for a kitchen large enough to cook for friends and a garden where I could grow sage, rosemary, and sunflowers. Marcus broke down the costs, about $380,000 for construction and materials, with $10,000 left for details like the porch swing, railings, and landscaping. The numbers fit perfectly. I signed the contract with hands that shook a little. This wasn't just money, it was memory being turned into wood and stone. While construction began, I found part-time work at a small cafe downtown called the Juniper Table. It wasn't because I needed the money anymore. I just couldn't imagine a life where I didn't serve people. The cafe was small and cozy, filled with plants and warm chatter. I worked morning shifts, pouring coffee for nurses, finishing night shifts for teachers grading papers, and for a young woman named Rosa King, who came in every day before work and always paid in cash. One day, I noticed she tucked every $5 bill she got as change into a jar labeled college. I asked her about it. She smiled shyly and said, "I've been saving for classes at the community college. It's slow, but I'll get there." Her determination reminded me of myself. 10 years ago, waiting tables and saving every cent for Grandpa's medicine. That day, I decided that once the house was finished, I'd help Rosa quietly, maybe pay her tuition for a semester. Not out of charity, but because kindness deserved to echo. The house began to rise from the ground like something waking up. Every week, I visited the site, boots sinking into soft dirt. The first time I saw the frame standing against the sky, I cried. The wood smelled fresh, and the breeze carried the sound of hammers like a heartbeat. Marcus stood beside me, arms crossed. "You're building something that matters," he said. "Not everyone gets to do that." But even as I poured myself into the project, the past tried to creep back in. Victor began calling again. First once, then every few days. When I didn't answer, he sent texts, sharp words wrapped in guilt. "You owe me." That money should have been split. "You wouldn't even have a dime without me pushing you to grow up." I read every message, saved them, and never replied. The first condition of the will was clear, and I would honor it. Cutting him off wasn't easy. He was my brother, and somewhere inside me, I still remembered the boy who used to sneak cookies into my lunchbox. But Grandpa had seen something I hadn't. The way Victor's pride corroded everything around him. Letting him go was painful, but necessary. As weeks turned to months, the skeleton of the house transformed into something beautiful. The windows went in, the porch took shape, and the walls smelled like new beginnings. Every nail driven, every board placed, felt like a small act of healing. I kept the receipts in a labeled folder. House for Grandpa. When I added up the costs one night, the total came to $598,340. I stood at the site near sunset one evening as the sky turned gold and violet. The house wasn't finished yet, but it already felt alive. The wind ran through the open doorways, and I could almost hear Grandpa's laugh echoing through the unfinished rooms. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing somewhere that was truly mine, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. The house wasn't just bricks and beams. It was proof that love, when tested, could become something lasting. On a bright Saturday in late spring, the house was finally finished. The last nail had been hammered, the porch swing hung steady, and the smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air. When Marcus handed me the keys, I stood there for a moment without moving. The blue front door gleamed in the sunlight, and behind it waited everything that 10 years of struggle and one act of love had built. I turned the key, opened the door, and stepped inside. The silence met me like a soft heartbeat. "We did it, Grandpa," I whispered. The place was everything I had imagined, and more. The oak stairs glowed with a honeyed light, and the big windows caught the afternoon sun in a way that made the walls shimmer. The library was my favorite room, shelves already lined with Grandpa's old books, and in the center, a single green chair where I could almost see him sitting. I ran my hand along the smooth wood of the banister and felt pride swelling in my chest. This was not just a house, it was a monument to faith, to endurance, to every late night and aching foot that had brought me here. A week later, I invited the family for a gathering. Aunt Lila arrived first with her husband, Thomas, and their daughter, Claire. They brought lemon bars and smiles, though I could see tears in Lila's eyes when she hugged me. My cousin Peter drove all the way from Savannah, Georgia, carrying a homemade apple pie that made the whole kitchen smell like autumn. Elena, my old friend from the Silver Spoon, flew in from Portland, Oregon, holding a small bouquet of daisies that she placed by the kitchen window. We filled the house with laughter, the kind that bounces off new walls and makes them feel lived in. As everyone wandered through the rooms, I told them the story in simple words. The 10 years at the diner, the nights I thought I wouldn't make it, the will, and the 2 conditions that had brought me here. I explained how the money wasn't a prize but a purpose, how half of it had turned into this home, a symbol of everything Grandpa stood for. When I showed them the blue door and the oak stairs, Aunt Lila touched the railing gently. "He'd be so proud," she said. But the day wasn't without shadows. Near sunset, I saw a familiar figure standing at the gate. Victor. He was wearing a dark gray suit and holding nothing but a look of cold resentment. For a moment, I thought of walking over, but then I remembered the first condition. I opened the door, and waited as he approached. "Let me in," he said flatly. "I'm family. You're my brother," I told him, my voice steady. "But you know what Grandpa asked of me." The first condition was clear. His eyes darted past me to the laughter inside, to the glow of the house that could have been his, if only he had seen love as something greater than pride. "You think this makes you better than me?" he snapped. "No," I said quietly. "It makes me grateful." He clenched his jaw, then turned and walked away without another word. I watched him disappear down the street, the air heavy but clean. The line between us was drawn, firm and final. When the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat on the porch, passing around lemonade and slices of pie. Marcus and his crew joined us, their laughter mingling with the sound of crickets. Elena told a story about the old diner grill that had once sparked like fireworks and how we put it out with a wet towel and a prayer. Aunt Lila reached for my hand. "Your grandfather was right about you," she said softly. "He saw what the rest of us couldn't." That night, when everyone had gone, I sat in the library under the warm glow of a single lamp. I opened my wallet and took out the old index card. On the back, I wrote new plans: start a small scholarship for cafe workers, $25,000 a year. Help Rosa with her college books, $1, $200. Fix Mrs. Cooper's fence, $300. The math didn't matter. What mattered was that giving still felt right. Before going to bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The city lights glittered below, and the night air smelled of wood and new beginnings. I sat on the swing, listening to its soft creak. The chain held, the house held, and I held. This is my story of work, loss, love, and the quiet kind of victory that doesn't need applause. I served tables for 10 years, honored 2 conditions, and built a home that stands as proof of who I became. I was here. I did the hard thing. And I am not sorry.